Hi, everyone. Welcome to Flinking Fast and Slow, how to successfully be an early adopter of Flink at your company with a particular focus on scaling and integration. So my name is Caito Scherr. I'm a software engineer, and I live in Portland, Oregon in the US. I've been using Flink for about 2 years, and I've been using it in production for a little over a year. Last year, I co-presented here at Flink Forward with my teammate at the time, Nick Davis. This is us being really nervous about our talk at the Sky Lounge last year. All right, so that's a bit about me, and I'd love to get to know all of you a little bit better. I'm going to do the whole show of hands thing. How many of you are software engineers? All right, sweet. I feel like I almost shouldn't ask the rest of the questions. How many of you are on a team that's only software engineers, like no other ops engineers? Okay, cool. How many of you manage other software engineers? Oh, okay, that's a pretty good amount, actually. How many of you are using Flink in production? Sweet. Okay, how many of you want to be using Flink in production? Yes. Okay, awesome. That is the number I wanted. Sweet. Okay, so I hope that all of you can get something from the talk then, because that's a nice number of you all out there. And this talk is pretty much focused on someone who's on or manages a team of software engineers who want to build a reliable, successful Flink service in production, specifically at a company that's kind of new to this technology. Okay, so Flink is fast, super, super fast. But early adoption can be painfully slow. And because Flink is so fast, sometimes adoption kind of needs to start off slow to make sure that you're fully set up for success. This goes particularly if you're at a company with a very regimented way of doing things. Viverica has really awesome docs on how to get running in Flink and fast, so if you're working in a simpler environment, you may just need this documentation. But if not, you may need to slow things down and kind of adjust your processes. So how do you keep up with something that is so fast? So to me, it's kind of like training for a marathon. So this actually happened to me last August. I'm a runner, and I signed up for a 2-day relay race with thousands of other runners that was 2 whole days straight across half the state of Oregon, and I'd never done this kind of race before. And I had to come to terms with the fact that just because I'm a runner does not mean that I'm remotely prepared for this kind of race. So how do I ensure that I can keep up with a fast pace at such a large scale with a huge variety of challenges that I've never experienced? I had to completely reevaluate how I trained. I had to make sure I was on the same page as my teammates and my leaders. And I had to invest in completely new running gear. Okay, so in this context, maybe you're a really experienced engineer. Maybe you've even worked with really powerful, really fast streaming frameworks before. The team I was on was also comprised of engineers with skills like this. However, when integrating this new service into something that is so large and so complex, we found that in order to keep up with something as fast as Flink, we still had to really slow down and make some serious adjustments to how we went about building and integrating a new app like this. We had to reevaluate our current processes. We had to reset expectations with our stakeholders and our other teammates, and we had to gather completely new resources. This is what I felt was some of the most important takeaways from that experience. So first, I'll go a little bit more background in our use case so you can get a little bit of idea of some of the challenges and pitfalls that we faced. Then I'll go over the challenges and solutions we found as part of being early adopters. And then I'll talk about the operational challenges that were unique to us for working with Flink and how we resolved those. And lastly, I'll discuss the unique challenges that we found when using such a powerful, high-speed framework and the impact that a framework like that has on an ecosystem you're trying to integrate it with. And firstly, I want to set a couple definitions. I'm referring to us as early adopters, but that can mean different things to a lot of different people. In this context, I'm referring to us being the first ones at our company that is building a Flink app specifically in production use. So last year, my team had just launched our company's first Flink app into production, an easier to maintain Flink service. So this is the next chapter, or the second part of that story. To understand the scale we're working with, this is a company of over hundreds of different services and apps in dozens of different languages and frameworks. There's various hubs and connections between these different services. Some are new, and some are old, and some may be very old. And we had to build the service quickly, but because of this intricate system, it had to be done really, really carefully. But we also had to figure out how to streamline this, and all with a small software engineering team. Going a bit deeper, this is a bit about the architecture of the Flink service that we needed to insert into that ecosystem. And I'm going to do this really briefly just because of the time. If you want to know more, I had a much more detailed version in my talk last year, which is on the Flink Forward website. So our Flink service starts with a Kafka topic. This topic contains data that's been piped in from other internal apps. Specifically, it contains data about customer usage for each of those apps. The data is then consumed by a Flink app that performs various calculations and modifications, like mapping and reducing that data. The data is then consumed by a second Kafka topic. This topic is also taking in data from other apps, and all of the data is then aggregated together on a daily cadence. This topic is now a collection of all of the daily aggregated usage data, which is then consumed by a second Flink app that adds things like timestamps and watermarks. This newly, neatly organized collection of data is then sent off to an internal data store, which is where the UI and other apps will pull from. Okay, so now we have a bit of an understanding of the architecture, and I want to go a bit more in depth on the challenges that we face in integrating this into that complex tech stack. Okay, so we're early adopters. This means that for us, Flink was not very well known. For example, we had dozens, probably actually more like hundreds, of Java and Ruby experts at this big company, but only a handful had ever heard of Flink. This can potentially cause a lot of pushback from your org or company. On the other hand, you could have a company full of people who are really excited about Flink and really want to support you, but they may not understand the additional needs or operational costs of operating Flink, or what it means in terms of getting you those additional resources and making sure that you can be successful. So in addition to the initial barrier of people not being familiar, Flink also has needs that are quite unlike the languages or frameworks we'd used in the past. Part of this was the streaming aspect, but the main obstacle for us was the very different operational needs. In this case, it was just as important to address the issues of pushback as it was to ensure that the stakeholders and advocates understood what they're getting into and at least have a general idea of the unique and additional cost of adopting and fully integrating Flink at this scale in order to have that support. And it's actually not even just stakeholders. If you're integrating something into a large scale or complex software ecosystem, other engineers will have to interact with your app, particularly if you're using Flink to push lots of data through a large pipeline with apps or databases upstream or downstream of you. We found it was particularly important for other engineers around us to actually understand Flink as well, or at least certain components. For instance, at this company, we had other teams that facilitate most of the containerization for our engineering teams. Due to needing to store additional pieces of information, like the most recent save points during a specific time period, we had needs that were very different from the needs of other teams that use that resource. This situation has the potential to be a burden on other teams and meant that this can be a big additional cost to companies in adopting Flink, which is why I want to address it. Even if you're storing your image or other components yourself, you may still have other engineering teams that interact with the same databases or AWS buckets that you might be storing them in. In addition, for a shared resource with lots of teams using it, there's more people who are going to be affected if anything goes wrong with it. If you're in this situation, it can be really beneficial for all engineers who interact with this shared resource to have some understanding of your use case, or at least have a basic familiarity with terms they might come across when viewing monitoring for those shared resources, especially since these may actually be new terms for them. So one way we kind of solved this was by building a group of advocates throughout the company. It sounds like a lot of work, because how do you familiarize your engineering org with what they need to know about Flink, especially if they may not even be interested? How do you do this with minimal effort so you can still focus on your engineering work? One thing that enabled us to build a strong group of advocates was engineer presentations. Each of my team members, of their own choice, ended up giving presentation about Flink within and sometimes without of, but still representing the company, like at a Flink conference. These talks covered everything from the most basic benefits of Flink to working Flink into specific themed internal presentations. For instance, if this month's internal lightning talk topic is databases, maybe you can talk about how Flink can integrate or provide faster, more scalable data streaming to your internal database. Most of us have done this to grow our own individual careers, and I would recommend doing this partially because that is an awesome added benefit. It's a great way to make yourself deep dive into various aspects of Flink while also growing a group of followers who are invested in your success and in Flink. But you also might ask, why is it important for engineers to be involved in this part? That's not my job, right? But the engineers are the most likely ones who have done those deep dives and can be the most effective recruiters, not just because they have that deeper technical understanding, but they also know what effective support looks like. And because they're also in the best position to cultivate the enthusiasm of others at your company if they're well and able to do so. Secondly, internal documents. I don't just mean having documents that other teams can read and be easy to follow, which is also great. But we found there was a huge return on investment for things like internal blog posts about our Flink progress. This was another experience for our engineers that also helped them grow their individual careers and gain recognition for their technical accomplishments. But it was also a really user-friendly and minimal effort way to interact with potential advocates and stakeholders throughout the company hierarchy. Additionally, some of these posts were more kind of like how-to, and we actually were able to enable other people to feel comfortable experimenting on their own, which really, really escalated that familiarity quickly. So we also had interactive support. We escalated this Flink community by creating a Flink channel in our company Slack for people to discuss and get help with Flink work within the company, as well as personal Flink projects. More specifically, my teammates were often in there answering all kinds of questions about other teams' Flink projects. This is another huge return on investment because it both created an opportunity to share Flink expertise with those who may not otherwise feel it worthwhile to investigate, and it quickly grew our own support network, which we very much were able to lean on later when we needed it. To summarize, we took the time early on in the project to invest in cultivating interest in Flink within the company through giving talks and internal blog posts, and we started a support group for troubleshooting via creating easy and open channels of communication. And in the end, this resulted in a big group of people at all different levels of the company, including individual contributors, architects, and management, who were all willing to advocate for us and help us out when we needed it. The recruiting effort on behalf of the engineers in the end actually allowed us to focus more on our engineering work and really streamline that process. You really can grow a community of invested stakeholders with minimal effort. Because overall, being the only one doing Flink is kind of hard. So if you can, make it so you're not the only one. So moving on to the operational challenges. What are some of the unique needs that you as engineers or your stakeholders or leadership might need to be aware of? Flink may be compatible with the languages you're using, but it doesn't mean it's going to be compatible with your existing infrastructure. For us, at this large company, we found that although we were guaranteed enough storage for our Flink image and enough retention for the mass amounts of data we were streaming, the existing infrastructure was not ideal for storing and querying save points, as I mentioned before, and we ended up having to write some additional code that ended up being a little bit tricky. Secondly, who owns the monitoring, alerting, and incident responsibilities for integration points between your Flink app and others? Most software companies already have guidelines in place for app and integration ownership, but we found these guidelines are often built for non-streaming apps or otherwise apps that have much simpler needs than Flink. This meant that the pre-existing guidelines for ownership might need to be reevaluated if you're an early adopter at your company. We had to be really intentional about how we spent our engineering hours as well, because of course we're learning a new framework and there's all the integration costs, and we were also learning about this particular type of data streaming and about the operational costs, which many of us had not been exposed to in this sort of way before. Okay, so ownership along your pipeline may need to be redefined. This sounds complicated, particularly in a well-established company. But if you consider a couple basic options, it can be relatively easy to determine how to readjust. Maybe the current allocation of ownership works fine for your new Flink app. Maybe one of your downstream apps is a top-tier product and the rest are not even in production, so maybe it makes more sense to allocate resources there. But for us, maybe you need to think outside the box and draw the line on owning monitoring and incident responsibilities for upstream and downstream apps based on how your Flink app interacts with them or impacts them. We went this route and took our responsibility for integration and monitoring for some apps depending on how they deliver the data to us. In this case, we drew the line on whether or not the data was pre-aggregated or not. And we took this responsibility because as the Flink app builders, we actually impacted those apps much more and had a better understanding of the modifications that went on for their data. So it was actually lower costs for both teams to readjust the existing responsibilities in this way. Secondly, we found it was important to have at least one Flink expert, or at minimum, someone who's prepared to and allowed to spend time deep diving on Flink. Because traction can be really slow for all the engineers trying to learn this new framework. And it's not completely unusual for building a new app. And I know it's expensive, to hire a new expert or even building your own. But in my experience, it's actually a bit more expensive to not have this resource. And you also may already have an internal expert. You may not even know you have one. We discovered that we had an expert at our company when we were looking into this, someone who'd actually attended this conference many times. So we needed to ensure the company would invest time both for us to get started and for this person to provide us with semi-regular guidance. And maybe someone on your engineering team is already on their way to being an expert, and all they need is just an afternoon or day per week to do some deep dives, and then they can be ready to provide that kind of guidance. And I want to go back to that point. So hiring or creating your own expert may be expensive, but getting that guaranteed dedicated time from that expert was actually our tipping point that made us as engineers decide to adopt Flink instead of another streaming framework. So if you're in leadership or authority or have plans for new Flink app, I really want to emphasize that last point. The engineers almost went with a different framework because we knew just how important it was to have that resource. And there's other options too. So maybe the expense of training an internal resource and hiring an external one is about equal. Or maybe the weight or urgency means that an external consultant is going to be more worth the cost. Of course, this is more of a leadership consideration, but we found that it was actually really important to make sure that us as engineers were involved in this. For us, we actually did look into this, and our stakeholders decided to have the consultants interviewed not by leadership, but by a combination of our engineers, it was me actually, and one of our site reliability champions who'd been assigned to us, which was very effective. And another resource that can minimize those engineering hour costs is having a dedicated architect, which sounds like a nice to have regardless, right? But it's much more important for a complex integration challenge like this. And the person does not actually even need to have an architect in the title. They don't even need to know anything about Flink. But there are some must-haves for this resource. You have to find someone who's deeply familiar with the capabilities of your other apps, and of course their integration points. But the person also has to have an understanding of deployment processes and image hosting, or at least general containerization knowledge. It's also helpful to have a list of milestones for just when you'll need architect involvement. These may not be the same milestones that are important or tracked by your stakeholders, but they might include things like days you plan on doing integration tests or the initial meeting where you make your technical plan for upgrading your Flink image version. To summarize, you can lower engineering costs by gathering more of the right resources, and you can streamline the process of building and integrating a new Flink app by reevaluating your current definitions of responsibility throughout your whole data pipeline. All right, now getting back to the impact of such a fast framework and how we can keep up. So this is one of my favorite quotes from one of my old colleagues who said, "Flink is like a thing you have to release into the wild, then go chasing after, like a squirrel, maybe." So we love how fast it is, but sometimes it means that you may be doing some chasing in order to keep up. The impact of its speed on your ecosystem is something that really needs to be understood before it's released. Flink is amazing at scaling and streaming huge amounts of data, which is why we love it and probably why we're all here. But a lot of our other frameworks and apps were either not so amazing at that, or at least were not initially built to accommodate that. So how do you insert something as powerful as Flink into a system that may not be able to handle what Flink can consume or output? Are the teams who run the app upstream and downstream of you prepared to take on this technical integration challenge? Like most others, our company already had clear protocols for informing and including all upstream and downstream teams before integrating or testing or launching an app. However, because this is a Flink early adopter situation, we are pushing so much data through so much faster than we ever had previously, so we actually needed to be more familiar with our upstream and downstream apps than we normally are, particularly ones that have sensitive alerting around increases or pauses in data flow. As a baseline for monitoring and alerting, we had to ensure that every upstream and downstream apps team understood enough of our metrics to be able to parse our monitoring outputs so they had the autonomy to better diagnose whether an issue was on our end or theirs, or at least be able to follow along in case of an outage. There's a lot of ways to make this not so painful for the other teams, though. For us, we just had a Slack chat channel for all the teams upstream and downstream of us that also included other stakeholders and followed a previously agreed upon protocol for giving them a heads up that things might be down or their monitoring might report something unusual. And for ensuring that these teams could understand our monitoring, most of this was less than an hour of just relabeling our dashboards and posting those links into that chat channel. So super, super simple. In conclusion, so I think we all understand Flink is kind of fast. And if you're going to be building and integrating a new Flink app in a complex environment, and if your company is not very familiar with this framework, you may need to do some readjustments, you may need to reset some expectations, and you may need to gather some new resources to catch up. But take it from me, when you speed through that finish line, it is totally worth it. And with that, thank you all so much for being here. You all helped make this one of my favorite conferences. So thank you.
Any questions?
Hi, thank you for the talk. So what were you using before you actually adopted Flink, and what was the impact of Flink? Like, how much better was everything after Flink?
That's a very good question, and so I actually left this company, and I'm like filtering for how much of this is proprietary, so I may have to think about that for a second. But previously it was the same use case, so it was the same. We wanted to get all of this customer usage information, but we were using basically just using different frameworks, different languages, and we needed to scale really quickly. So it was a very similar set of calculations, similar set of algorithms that we were using, but the old system was just not able to handle the amount of data that we knew that we were going to need to push through at the speed that we needed it to. One of the reasons we picked Flink was we knew that we could track the data going through better, and we wanted really, really granular ways of watching it go through. So I don't know if that kind of helps to answer that.
Any more question? Maybe for one more question? Thank you. Thanks, Caito.
Thanks.